The Declaration of Interdependence. We declare that all humanity is in a state of interbeing. From this, we conclude that no one person is separate from the rest of humanity. No human being could exist by themselves at all. We are dependent on each other and the environment. This means that all humans share an equal right to enjoy happiness and to avoid suffering. This is the wish of all sentient beings. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namandots. Greetings. I'm Elaine Donlin, Minister's Assistant at the Buddhist Church of San Francisco. And that piece was called The Declaration of Interdependence. It was written about 8 years ago by Jerome Friedman, a member of Thich Nhat Hanh's Buddhist school. And I've been posting it on our BCSF Facebook page each 4th of July. And I think it's even more pertinent with this present 4th of July, as we find ourselves in the reality of interdependence, where we can't look away from it, where we have to acknowledge it because our very life depends on recognizing this universal truth. With a global pandemic raging across the country and a racial justice movement shaping our current cultural and political landscape, both are reminding us that we are profoundly, inherently, and inextricably interdependent. Last month, I received an email out of the blue. It was sent by a young man who had been raised in the Shin temple and who had just graduated from college. And he wanted to know if and how Shin Buddhism intersects with what's happening in our country right now. And so in his email, he asked me the following 3 questions. 1, how can Buddhism be culturally relevant to Black Lives Matter and the George Floyd protests? Does Buddhism support protests and civil disobedience? I wonder this because so much of Buddhism seems to be about meditation and the focus on the internal acceptance of suffering. 3, is Siddhartha Gautama's story of being born as a wealthy prince relevant to today's racial justice movement? In Dharma school, the Buddhist lessons we were taught occurred centuries ago. Is Siddhartha's story and sitting under the Bodhi tree even relevant to today's current suffering, like understanding racism as suffering? Wow. Our children are looking and thinking and questioning, trying to reconcile their Shin upbringing with all that's unfolding in our world today. I so welcome this inquiry and tried to respond to him thoughtfully and honestly. To question number 1, how can Buddhism be culturally relevant to Black Lives Matter and the George Floyd protests? I wrote back, what do you mean by culturally relevant? If by culture you mean Japanese American culture, I can't speak to that because I'm not Japanese American. I'm Hungarian and Mexican. But Buddhism, the Buddhist teachings transcend culture. Culture is often the vessel for the transmission of the teachings, but it shouldn't be mistaken for the essence of the teachings or the teachings themselves, which is sometimes a misunderstanding in our Shin temples. The teachings transcend culture. That's why they're still relevant 2,600 years later. I think Buddhism is totally relevant to what's going on and happening in our culture today because Buddhism is about seeing things as they are, not as we wish them to be. It's about recognizing our bombu, foolish, deluded perspectives, which we often mistake for truth or reality. As a Buddhist, I'm called to look deeply at myself, my actions, my speech, and most importantly, my thoughts. Have I benefited from covert, socially acceptable white supremacy and the racist institutions that arose from it? Absolutely. Have I done enough to work on my own internalized, socially conditioned biases? No. So I have a lot of work to do to truly becoming an ally to a group of people who have experienced such suffering and trauma since the founding of this country. What do I need to learn or unlearn? It's not just the shocking police killings. It's mass incarceration, racial profiling, discriminatory lending, hiring discrimination, housing discrimination, inequitable healthcare, education funding based on property taxes, Eurocentric curriculums, cultural appropriation, and denial of white privilege, just to name a few. I continued, as a Buddhist, we each are on our own path. And if I'm harming someone on my path through acquiescence or otherwise overt actions, then that's not a path of liberation. It's a path of ignorance. I, as a white Buddhist, can be an ally to the Black Lives Movement only when I can honestly look at my own white privilege, acknowledge it, and set the intention to continue to examine it and to support Black Lives Matter with my body by joining peaceful protest, materially by contributing financially to organizations promoting restorative justice, and with my speech, talking with my family, my friends, and the Sangha, and most importantly, with my thoughts. I can continue to reflect with compassion on the causes and conditions contributing to institutionalized racism and oppression, and vow to eliminate them. This is none other than the Mahayana Bodhisattva vow of compassion, utilizing both intention and action. To question number 2, he asked, does Buddhism support protest and civil disobedience? I wonder this because so much of Buddhism seems to be about meditation and the focus on the internal acceptance of suffering. I wrote back, this is a 3-part question. First part, does Buddhism support protest and civil disobedience? Absolutely, especially if we use Siddhartha Gautama and Shinran as our examples. Please see elaboration in response to question number 3. For part 2, regarding sitting meditation, most people are surprised to find out that the vast majority of Buddhists in the world do not practice sitting meditation. Meditation is only one branch of the Eightfold Path, and that one branch has many manifestations. My personal experience is that mindfulness meditation is practiced both on and off the cushion. And I would maintain that our Shin chanting is voice meditation, and that the Nembutsu is hearing meditation. In America, sitting meditation became synonymous with Buddhism, but this is an incomplete view. Lastly, the focus on internal acceptance of suffering. This is only half the picture. Siddhartha Gautama, when asked about his teaching, once said, I teach suffering in the end of suffering. Suffering doesn't simply end by accepting it. As the great 8th century Buddhist monk and scholar Shantideva wrote, I do not desire suffering, yet fool I am, I desire the cause of suffering. The idea is to figure out what is the cause of our suffering. In our Shin teaching, we call it the 3 poisons of attachment, aversion, and delusion. And in Dharma school, we teach the kids, it's called gas, greed, anger, and stupidity. And it's transformed, not merely accepted. Shinran spoke of this transformation in The Lamp for the Latter Ages, letter number 20. Quote, formerly you were drunk with the wine of ignorance and had a liking only for the 3 poisons of greed, anger, and folly. But since you have begun to hear the Buddha's vow, you have gradually awakened from the drunkenness of ignorance, gradually rejected the 3 poisons, and come to prefer at all times the medicine of Amida Buddha. Unquote. Buddhism is about transformation. Many of us in our tradition have often heard, come as you are, period, full stop. Yes, everyone's welcome. Just come as you are. So do come as you are. But hopefully, as Shinran noted, we won't stay as we are. Allow the mind to be transformed. Allow the heart to be transformed. And finally, to question number 3, this young man asked, Is Siddhartha's story of being born as a wealthy prince relevant to today's racial justice movement? In Dharma school, the Buddhist lessons we were taught occurred centuries ago. Is Siddhartha's story and sitting under the Bodhi tree even relevant to today's current suffering? Like understanding racism as suffering. I wrote the following. I think Siddhartha's story is more relevant today than ever. Post-Enlightenment, Siddhartha's first teaching in Sarnath, India, formed the basis of every Buddhist school and tradition when he explained the Four Noble Truths. The first truth of dukkha, often translated as suffering, unhappiness, pain, dis-ease, it refers to the fundamental unsatisfactoriness and painfulness of our mundane, unenlightened life. The second noble truth is the origin of dukkha. In Sanskrit, it's called tanha, or thirst, desire, greed, craving. Isn't this a source of oppression that African Americans have experienced during their entire history here in the US? Doesn't tanha explain the white slave owner's thirst for free labor, the greed? Isn't tanha the source of the subsequent Jim Crow laws, craving to maintain white privileged positions in society, government, and law? Doesn't tanha explain the dominant white culture's desire for power and control, expressed in the resistance to African American equality, African American equity, African American humanity? The third noble truth is hopeful, as it is the truth of the cessation of dukkha, that we don't have to live with a mind imprisoned by tanha. And of course, the fourth noble truth is the path that leads to the cessation of dukkha, this unsatisfactoriness. I continued writing. Siddhartha's movement was one of transformation. He radically rejected the caste system, stating that all beings have Buddha nature, the affirming potential to awaken. Everyone. This is fundamentally what Black Lives Matter is asking. To be treated equally as a human being, to be afforded all the rights and privileges other human beings are afforded, especially white human beings. Siddhartha recognized the racism and discrimination that was perpetuated within the caste system and radically condemned it. He introduced the idea of placing a higher value on morality and the equality of people, instead of on which family or privileged caste a person was born into. Fast forward to medieval Japan, and Shinran, our tradition's founder, was expressing the same ideal in his writings, only with Japan's version of untouchables, the Barakumen. Barakumen, meaning hamlet or village people, dates back to the feudal era. It originally referred to these segregated, socially excluded groups at the bottom of the traditional Japanese social order, and they historically have been the victims of severe discrimination and ostracism. In Shinran's time, they were the laborers working in occupations tainted by death, such as undertakers, or those jobs considered impure like butchers, and those working in leather, and the sellers of such, all the unclean and impure professions. When Shinran, following his teacher Honen, first established the Nembutsu practice, it liberated those who were oppressed and persecuted due to this institutionalized class discrimination. In fact, most Barakumen belong to Shinran's Buddhist group, and both the Nishi and the Higashi Honganji have had a history of Barakumen followers. I've often heard it was the uneducated peasant field workers who really benefited from Shinran's teaching, but those were largely the Barakumen. In Notes on the Essentials of Faith Alone, Shinran writes about, quote, not discriminating between the inferior and the highly gifted, unquote, common cultural labels applied at the time. And so he goes on to explain, quote, the hunter is the one who slaughters many living things. The peddler is the one who buys and sells things. They are called low. Such peddlers, hunters, and others are none other than we are, who are like stones and tiles and pebbles, unquote. None other than we are. This highly educated and privileged former monk, Shinran, saw himself and all of us as equal to the Brahmin, the butchers, the undertakers, the peddlers. And so Shinran taught the Nembutsu to everyone without favor, without discrimination. And that was a radical act. In Shinran's Hymns to the Pure Land, Wasan number 5, he wrote, "The liberating wheel of light is without bound. Each person that touches it is taught, is freed from attachment to being and non-being. So take refuge in Amida, the enlightenment of non-discrimination." Namandots. In other words, we are all, without exception, equally embraced by Amida. Everyone is included. As Jodo Shin Buddhist, our goal is to awaken to this spiritual truth of interdependency and equality. And I found that if I truly do that, if I entrust in this embodiment of great love and great compassion, as Shinran called it, then I must do whatever I can to support the liberation of my sisters and brothers in the Black Lives Matter movement. So that was my reply to this young man's 3 questions. So how do we respond to social movements exposing systemic racism and discrimination? Buddhism tells me with engagement. In 1922, the National Equality Society was founded in Kyoto, Japan, by the Barakumin to do away with their inequality. Mankichi Saiko, who was a founder of that movement, was also a Shin Buddhist priest. Human beings do not live in perfect equality. Oppressed groups exist, and they suffer disadvantages on the basis of how they are perceived. But because everything is impermanent, there's the possibility, the opportunity for change. In the Kimsuka Sutra, Shakyamuni Buddha said, whatever has the nature to arise has the nature to cease. That would include institutional and structural racism. May we continue to realize, understand, and appreciate that we are interconnected. And as Shin Mahayana practitioners on the Bodhisattva path, our liberation will be collective, or it will not be liberation. That is what I hear in the Nembutsu calling out to me. Please join me in Gassho. Namo Amida Butsu. 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 Namandots. 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 Thank you for listening, and let's continue to take care of each other.